This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 248. The Fallacy of the Supply Curve.
Well, last week we looked at how economics textbooks had taught us the law of demand and how it was all wrong, drawing those demand curves on very simple graphs, all just plain wrong. Well, today, the supply curve makes even less sense, if that's possible, for something that makes no sense whatsoever. How can it be any less sense than that? But we'll look at it anyway. So in 2 weeks, we will have pulled apart the first chapter of every school economics textbook. Economists say. That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, last time we looked at the fallacy of the demand curve. It's not a law, we decided. It doesn't always respond to changes in price at the aggregate level anyway, because there are so many other factors to consider. And when you factor in the relationship between workers, capitalists and bankers, the whole theory falls apart. Listen to last week's podcast for more on that. Today, it gets even more exciting. The supply curve and the point at which, and we are going to do both of these today, the supply curve and the point at which the two intercept. I don't think we can separate them out. By the way, Steve, after last week, Mitchell wrote and said, are there any books you can suggest for someone with a basic economic understanding, or a basic economics background, mm-hmm. Anything you would suggest to help them understand and improve their overall knowledge? This is in relation to, getting down to the basics that we spoke about last week. Where would you start? If you'd read all those economics textbooks and now you wanted the truth, where would you start, other than obviously debunking economics?
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that one for me. The other one that is really it's 100% critique. The other book I'd recommend is one which was out of print for a hell of a long time by an Australian mathematician called John Blatt. I think I mentioned John Black a couple of times, but I'll give it a background here. He was exposed to economics by being invited along to attend a talk by one other person at the same university he was at, who was also nominated for but didn't get the relevant Nobel Prize. So Blatt was nominated twice for the Nobel Prize in physics. The guy who invited him was nominated once for the Nobel Prize in economics. And when the guy giving the economics talk finished and asked Blatt what he thought, Blatt said, "That is the greatest world of rubbish I have sat through in my entire academic career, and I intend to find there must be something. If that is advanced economics, there's something seriously wrong, and I intend finding out what it is." That's my very bad attempt at an Austrian accent.
Not that we work on stereotypes at all.
Not at all. No, I've got a
a
couple of Austrians in my background that I can actually research if necessary. So he wrote this book called Dynamic Economic Systems, and in my opinion, it is the best ever overview of economics, both critique and putting forward alternatives. And then it went out of print. Well, very luckily, a short while ago, I think it's Routledge, re-released it as a Kindle. So search for John Blatt, B-L-A-T-T, and the book is called Dynamic Economic Systems. And please ignore Amazon's summary that it's about Hong Kong commercial law.
That will have put a few people off.
Yeah, I'm sure it has.
So Blatt is the name to look. That reminds me, by the way, I remember getting in trouble years and years ago at school. I know it was heavily influenced by Spike Milligan, clearly in my early days. We had to write, it was something that would appear on someone's gravestone, just a lesson in creativity. And mine was, "Here lies Reginald Spratt, who ran in front of a bus." Splat. That was for some reason I got in trouble. I thought it was genius. Now, okay, let's look at the supply curve.
Not as good as what is actually on the Spike Milligan's tombstone. You know what that is, don't you?
I told you I was ill. Was that one in his?
That's it. Yeah, I told you I was ill.
And I love the fact that he. What was the town on the Central Coast in New South Wales? Woy Woy, the world's biggest above ground cemetery. We could just spend an hour talking Spike Milligan, couldn't we? In fact, I could.
We could.
There was a baboon who one afternoon decided to ride to the sun. So with I can't remember it now. So with two great palms strapped to his arms, he started his takeoff run. Mile after mile, he galloped in style, but he never once left the ground. "You're going too slow," said a passing crow. "Try reaching the speed of sound." So he put on a spurt. By God, how it hurt. Both of his souls. Now there, I'm losing it now. But there we are. Amazing
I'm going to give you that, ladies and gentlemen. That is completely unscripted and live. Okay, so this is
now what were we going to talk about?
The deep memory bank of Phil Dobbie on Spike Milligan.
What were we going to talk about today? The supply curve.
Supply curve,
which Spike Milligan never wrote about, because he realised it was even for him it was nonsense. But Interesting, isn't it? Looking at the supply curve, an example of where maybe it does work is in the oil industry. Given all it takes is a blocked Suez. See what I did there? To send
blocked Suez. Yeah. Well done.
Sending prices rising.
No claps for that one. Sorry.
Sending prices rising. So surely that is a case that we do have this elasticity in supply, where we see this responsiveness in supply. If supply falls, straight away the oil price shoots up. Immediately, not for long. But this is one industry, isn't it? An example where in that industry prices are completely driven by supply. And that supply obviously is controlled by an oligopoly as well.
Yeah, that's a good example, because I'm going to be trashing the theory of supply as it applies to manufactured goods. But Fallacy, who is really the economist that non-orthodox economists should name themselves after, we decided in a poll on Twitter just recently, made the point that commodity prices like that, where the supply is limited and the stuff, particularly when it's going to decay like in agricultural output, but equally oil, where it has to be available or your cars don't move. The demand, the price will respond very rapidly to a shortage in supply. It's got nothing to do with the marginal cost of getting it out of the ground. The price is far higher than that, but that is demand determined, and the price will vary very radically because the supply can plunge. As we've seen, as soon as that canal is blocked, then no oil gets through from the oil-producing states on the south side to the oil-consuming states on the north side of the Suez Canal, and the price goes up through the roof. So and also a higher supply will encourage a higher price will encourage a higher level of supply. In that sense, an upward sloping supply curve for oil makes plenty of sense.
But you said it there, didn't you? You mentioned, the margin. So the supply curve in the economics textbooks, the quantity produced on the x-axis, we've got the price on the y-axis. The law says the higher the price, the more producers will want to supply higher quantities to the market to make more money. But is it the price or is it the margin on that product, which obviously is a very different thing?
Well, it comes down to this whole word marginal, and economics. The actually neoclassical economists were originally described as, quote unquote, the marginalists, and they say everything happens on the margin. And if you read Greg Mankiw's brilliantly exciting literary wonder called the Microeconomics, the textbook of microeconomics, which I read occasionally when I can't get to sleep fast enough. It says that economists know that everything is calculated at the margin. So on the demand curve, which we trashed in the last podcast, that's supposed to be the marginal benefit of consuming a commodity, and the marginal benefit falls as the quantity consumed rises, whereas the supply curve is literally supposed to be the marginal cost curve. And this is supposed marginal cost is, it's not that you have to offer a higher price to induce suppliers to supply more to the market, and their margin, the profit margin, goes up as a result. It's literally it is based exclusively on the idea that the amount of productivity they get out of their factories declines as you increase output. So that's what they call diminishing marginal productivity. And the inverse of diminishing marginal productivity effectively is rising marginal cost. So the whole thing comes down to the idea it costs more. As you increase the amount being produced, it costs more to produce that amount, and that's why the price rises. Right.
But that is the opposite of economies of scale, isn't it? Now, I know there are diseconomies of scale when you reach a point, but isn't the idea with economies of scale that the more you produce, that the higher the margin you're going to get? If you're charging the same price at each level, the higher the margin you're going to get.
Well, when they talk about economies of scale, and this is one of the few sensible things in economics, though neoclassicals managed to mangle it up anyway, but economies of scale are the thing where you change the actual scale of operations. So you go from a blast furnace, which is, imagine this is a bit like what physicists will do, assume a spherical cow. Well, I'm going to assume a square, a cubic blast furnace. So if you have a blast furnace, which is 1 cubic metre, that's going to have 6 square metres of steel, because each side of that cube, there are 6 sides, each side is going to be 1 metre by 1 metre. So you've got 1 square metre per side, 6 of them to make up the overall cube. That's 6 square metres, and that 6 square metres can process 1 cubic metre of of stuff at any one time to produce your output. But if you double the size of the cube, you go from 1 metre to 2 metres per side, then you're going to have 4 square metres size. That's 24 square metres as your area, but the internal area goes to 8. So you have a fourfold increase in your area, and so that tells you how much it costs to produce, how much steel you need to make this cubic blast furnace. But the volume goes from 1 cubic metre to 8 cubic metres, 2 by 2 by 2. And so you get an 8-fold increase in output with a 4-fold increase in the cost, and that's economies of scale. Now, what economists are great at doing, and I'm so sick of them doing it, I'm going to call them out before they bloody well do it to this particular podcast, is if you show something up which demolishes the argument about marginal cost rising, which is a short-term thing where you don't change the scale of operation, you're assuming in that theory that your capital machinery is fixed. You take them on that, they'll throw something about you from economies of scale. They'll do it all the damn time. So bugger off. We're talking about a situation which is just in the short term, where, back to my my cubic blast furnace example, you've got a blast furnace which is one cubic blast furnace where each side of that blast furnace is 1 metre long, and then you're supposed to get diminishing productivity out of that as you add in the production process, as you add more workers to the blast furnace, on the outside rather than the inside, obviously, and more steel. But I'm going to go from that his hypothetical example now to the real world and say we've got to look inside a real world factory to see what actually happens with diminishing marginal product and rising marginal cost, which is what the economists assume happens. But they're wrong. That doesn't happen at all. So where do we start? We get the basic theory. Why do you go?
Well, I mean, I think it's good to follow this economies of scale because, I mean, this is crucial to the direction the supply curve takes, isn't it? So
no, it's not. No. The economies of scale are a long-term thing. That's where you can change the scale of your operation.
Right. Okay. And this is supposed to be a point in time.
This is a point in time where your capital is fixed. So you've got if you've got 1 cubic metre blast furnaces, and you'd be better off with 8 cubic metre blast furnaces. Tough cookies. That's the long term. In the meantime, you've got to do the best you can with your 1 cubic metre blast furnace.
Right. But what we see, of course, with oil, which is a useful comparison, isn't it? That because of the oligopoly that exists, then you've got producers who are turning down and turning up supply as they see fit. Whereas if you're running a factory, basically you run the factory hot, don't you? You've got the machines, you've got the people employed. You might as well produce 100% of what you can produce.
Now, Tarrant, mate, you're getting ahead of yourself here. You're bringing in reality.
But okay,
we haven't made it to reality.
But what
we haven't made it to reality yet.
Well,
right, an economic theory.
All right. Well, what's the economic theory then? That I would run my machines at 50% if that would help me arrive at the optimum price. That's what they're saying.
Yeah, effectively, yeah. And the logic they go through is to say, well, you've got this fixed amount of machinery, so you're fixed. You've got in the short term when you can't change your scale of operation, therefore economies of scale are irrelevant. In that sort of operation, you've got a fixed amount of machinery. Let's say you've got 100. Imagine you've got the standard size of a blast furnace at this stage is 1 cubic metre. So you've got all these 1 cubic metre blast furnaces, 100 of them inside a factory, and then you want to produce more output. Well, you can't change the number of machines or their scale, but you can change the number of workers you apply to the overall factory and the amount of material you put through each of those blast furnaces. Now, again, economics, as usual, abstracts from reality. So when you look at their models, and you take a look at a textbook like Mankiw, for example, Mankew's has some wonderfully imaginative names for his imagined companies. So one is Conrad's Coffee Shop. And Conrad's Coffee Shop has obviously just one espresso machine and produces between 1 and 10 cups of coffee per hour. Now, if you can find me a coffee shop that operates on that scale,
not a very successful one, I'd say.
Not a very successful one. There's a reason for that, by the way, which I can explain later. But they have this small scale of outputs, and what he shows is that the initial cup of coffee, the first one to be made, has a marginal cost of roughly 25 cents for the first cup of coffee. And then the marginal cost rises up to $2 per cup of coffee when you get up to 10 cups of coffee.
Why?
So what's actually why? Yeah. Why, you ask? Why? Why?
Why wouldn't it be?
Why?
Because the marginal cost is just the cost of the staff, hours, and the materials. I mean, it would be the same.
And they even leave the materials out. It's just the staff hours.
Right, okay.
So what they argue is that each worker you hire, you pay exactly the same wage. They presume there's either a competitive market, which means you're as a buyer of labour, you have no impact on the price in their usual nonsense theory, or they presume there's a fixed price like a trade union, you can't vary it, so you pay the same wage per worker, you get the same productivity out of each worker, so each worker is effectively identical. What is happening is that as you add more workers to the fixed amount of machinery you've got, the workers start to get into each other's way, and your productivity falls as you add more workers. They often start with an example where there's rising productivity for a while until you hit an ideal ratio of workers to machines. But then you get past that ratio and you're getting more output by adding more workers to the fixed number of machines, but that productivity is falling over time.
Right. So all of this is ignoring the money that I've spent buying that coffee machine in the first place, and therefore that the cost per coffee is going to be reduced the more coffee I produce, because the big cost is not the staff. Probably the big cost is actually having bought the very expensive coffee machine.
Oh no, the machine's trivial. I mean, just looking at the price here on Mankiw's Figure 4, Chapter 13, page 277 of the 2016 textbook, I think it is. What he's looking at is the financing cost of buying that cappuccino machine, the espresso machine. So for the one cup of coffee,
yeah. Okay. Well, it is small compared. Yeah.
He's saying that the hourly cost of that cappuccino machine, when you've got when you're producing 1 cup of coffee per hour, which is that's what I call a busy coffee shop, is $3. And when you get to 10 cups of coffee, the fixed cost is 25 cents. And there was the marginal cost of the maximum output. I'm just reading this right off the graph, which you might gather this is an article I'm writing right now, which I'll be giving to my patrons shortly. The average fixed cost at the maximum output of this Conrad's coffee shop of 10 cups per hour, the average fixed cost is 25 cents, whereas the marginal cost is $2. Okay, so he's got the marginal cost being 10 times the average fixed cost of that scale of output, and that's typical. That's what all these drawings, and there's no better way to describe them. They're simply drawings. They're not based on data. In all these textbooks have. So how do they explain it? How do you reckon they explain diminishing productivity with rising output?
Well, other than, as you've said, with people getting in the way of each other.
Yeah. That's what. There are
other examples as well. If you decided that you're going to open later into the night, for example, you could make more money out of the machinery you've got if you extended your hours. It might be more expensive to employ people in the.
They leave that out of the theory. Because
that's real world. I gave a real world example there. I apologise for bringing that into the economic discussion.
Okay. Let's go back to the fantasy world of neoclassical textbooks, and here is Caroline's Cookie Factory.
Right.
And here's the quote, page 273 of Mankiw. At first, when only a few workers are hired, they have easy access to Caroline's kitchen equipment. As the number of workers increases, additional workers have to share equipment and work in more crowded conditions. Eventually, the kitchen is so crowded that the workers start getting in each other's way.
They could buy more machines.
So what we've got is, in other words, what they're assuming is manufacturers are a bunch of effing idiots.
It does sound like that. And that is the whole theory. So the whole theory, because it is bizarre, and yet we sat through economics lessons being told that. So the economy,
Yeah. And
diseconomies of scale. This is all. This is the term they use.
No, not again.
Right.
It is down to how much of your capacity you actually utilise and how you design a factory. So let's jump across. Let's put myself on that fantasy world I had a moment ago of a steel mill with 100 blast furnaces each with a 1 cubic metre capacity.
Right, where you've been burning the workers in the glass. No, you
burning the workers. Yeah. We got to get the carbon from somewhere. Anyway, sorry.
Really? No,
should we edit that out?
No, we'll keep it in. But look, disrespect to blast furnace workers listing.
Okay.
Right?
So we've got. Let's say the ideal ratio of workers to blast furnaces is 10 workers per blast furnace. Okay. Then their theory effectively says that if you have 100 blast furnaces in your factory and you have 10 workers, you will have 1 worker per 10 blast furnaces. And that poor worker is sprinting around trying to do the work of 1,000 effectively, 100, doing the work. So you're using all of your fixed capacity and all of your labour simultaneously. Whereas in a realistic world, if you only had enough demand to justify 10 workers in a factory where you had 100 blast furnaces and there was 10 workers per blast furnace, you would have 1 blast furnace operating and the other 99 would be idle. Now, and then as you expanded output, each time you go in the ideal capacity of workers per blast furnace. Now, of course, in the real world, you don't end up with using 1% of your capacity. When you take a look at the capacity data for the United States, which is aggregate firm capacity, the maximum capacity of industrial capacity that's ever been utilised was back in 1965, and it was 88% of the capital. And if you think about, again, now I'm going to bring in time to some extent here, if you are designing a factory which is going to be adding to your existing productive capacity, then when you produce it, you don't want it to be completely consumed by new demand straight away. You want it to be able to last, say, 5 or 10 years. But if you build a factory to add on to your existing capacity and you hope it to be able to keep on going for 10 years, when you open that factory up, it'll be operating at 70% capacity.
So what shape is the supply curve then, in your mind?
Horizontal to falling. Right. And the interesting thing is,
so horizontal makes perfect sense to me, because because the costs are the same in effect. I mean, there could be economies of scale in the long term, which is presumably why you're saying it's falling. You've also got to factor in that there's many companies, of course, all competing, and supply is. So there's the interesting question: if that coffee shop had another coffee shop next door to it, and they were producing, the one coffee shop was selling 10 cups of coffee an hour, and another one opens up next door and starts selling 5 cups of coffee an hour, do we all drink 15 cups, or does their demand fall? And there's that industry wide and geographic location, all of that gets factored into it as well, doesn't it?
Well, what actually factors in is you are trying to compete with people where your costs are constant or falling. And the reason they're falling, by the way, it doesn't take economies of scale. If you have an enormous factory producing out, that's why I use the steel example, we tend to think in terms of stuff we go and visit ourselves, like coffee shops, but most of what we consume is made in large factories by large production companies. And what you've got is air conditioning designed over the entire environment, management, which has to, you've got management delegated to different sections of the production process as well. So as you
got all those fixed costs.
As you approach capacity, your costs are falling. For 2 reasons. One, your fixed costs are being amortised across a larger volume, and fixed costs are far larger than neoclassical economists think. So the example I gave in that textbook was that fixed costs were about 10% of marginal costs. In fact, when economists have gone and done this awful thing called research, where they actually go and ask firms what their costs are, what they have found is that fixed costs are at least 40% of total costs, not in that case 10%, but 40%, and often a lot higher, 85%.
Yeah, well, in that coffee shop, it's not the labour that's the cost. It's not the coffee machine, which is an incidental expense, and they're probably right on that. It's actually the rent for the premises is the major cost, and that doesn't move exactly.
Yeah. So what you have is a world in the factory world in which when it's well managed, first of all, you design the factory so it's most efficient at full capacity. Secondly, you start at below full capacity because you're in living in an environment where growth has been taken for granted. So whenever you build a factory, you build it with excess capacity to be able to handle a number of years of expansion. And then thirdly, you gave example of competing against a neighbouring coffee shop. You want the neighbouring coffee shop to give somebody salmonella poisoning so that suddenly they can't compete anymore and you take over all their demand, because as you take over more demand, your fixed costs are falling per unit, your can be variable costs are constant or falling per unit as well. You come out doubly ahead. So the real world is a world where you're competing against other firms, marketing yourself, so you try to get as much of your capacity used as possible. And if you don't have spare capacity, you're going to lose out when an opportunity comes along. That's the real world.
So the example from an economics textbook where you've got those two coffee shops, where the new one comes along, then you are going to push up the cost of coffee because you've now got two premises. So presumably the price of coffee is going to go up. You're going to move.
No, you've got a price per unit. So
the price per unit, given the fixed cost is so high, the price per unit would increase. But you're saying they ignore that because it's all to do with the marginal cost.
Well, there's all the marginal cost. But what they've got is a world in which diminishing productivity per worker causes rising marginal cost. That's entirely their logic. And the intriguing thing is that it's mainly economists from my side of the fence, the non-orthodox economists who've realised this doesn't make sense. And it actually goes right back to the 1930s, because in late 20s, early 30s, what's called the Oxford Study Group, a group of economists based at Oxford University, decided they could benefit from talking to businessmen, and businesses could benefit from talking to them. And when they had their first conversation, it was like the businessmen were wondering whether they walked into an opium den because they were feeling totally stoned by the conversation they were having, and all these concepts the economists were throwing at them about marginal cost and so on. You kind of say, what are you talking about? I mean, we don't think that way at all. And when the economists then decided to go and check out the factories and see what the cost structure was, what they found was these companies had high fixed costs, so the more units you sold, the lower your average fixed costs were. But most importantly, the variable costs, which they presumed would rise because of diminishing marginal productivity, were actually either constant or falling. So it was actually costing either as much or less to produce extra output. And therefore, if you have falling variable cost, that's looking at the number of workers times their wage, divided by the output level. If that's falling, then the marginal is actually below the average. And according to neoclassical economic theory, you would have no supply curve at all in that situation. Because they argue...
Yes. Yeah. What about the situation, though, where you've got, because nothing is produced in isolation. There's always a supply chain. So what happens when upping your production puts a demand on something on the supply chain which doesn't want to be increased in value? They're quite happy to supply at the level they are now, either because they reckon it's the optimum position for them in terms of the revenue they're going to get, or because they physically can't produce anymore because there's not enough space on ships, or there's not enough ground to grow the crops. Maybe it's something which is in limited supply. Then you are going to increase your cost the more you produce, aren't you?
You need to divert the 1926 Sraffa Award for that, because that's what Piero Sraffa put across as one of the two situations that demolishes the idea of supply curve. He said, when you look at the input and output dynamics, then you get a very, very different world. And particularly where you have when you're talking of the very broad definition of an industry, the broader your definition of an industry, like if you go from talking about making nails to manufacturing, then whatever you call your variable resource is going to be something where if you demand more of the variable resource and you're talking at the level of the manufacturing, then you're going to be taking workers away from services, and that's going to cause wages to rise. So he said those price dynamics can't be ignored at that level. But we're back at the level of looking at a factory just making nails. What goes on at that factory where you're making nails, where you're buying, you're hiring a relatively insignificant segment of the entire workforce, so you can get away with the assumption you're not going to drive up wages. And in that world, Sraffa said that it made logical sense that firms would work at the best ratio they can find between their fixed units and the demand they currently have. What stops them using 100% of their capacity is that they don't have enough demand to do that, so they're going to be competing against each other by product differentiation to try to grab the market that exists. And in that world, the cost of production will either be constant or falling. And when economists went out and did surveys, that's exactly what they found. So there's a whole literature, particularly in the 1940s and early 1950s, of non-orthodox economists going out and asking firms, what do your cost curves look like? And the answer that came back completely contradicted the textbooks. And I'm going to give you my favourite quote. The last time this was done was in 1998 by an economist by the name of Alan Blinder. And here's how he summarised his results. The overwhelmingly bad news here, brackets for economic theory, close brackets, is that apparently only 11% of GDP is produced under conditions of rising marginal cost. Almost half is produced under constant marginal cost, but that leaves a stunning 40% of GDP in firms that report declining marginal cost functions. He continued on the fixed cost issue. Firms report having very high fixed costs, roughly 40% of total costs on average. And he said many more companies report they have falling rather than rising marginal cost curves. While there are reasons to wonder whether the respondents interpreted the questions correctly, and this is the usual economist out, if your answer doesn't make sense, it's because you didn't understand my question. Their answers paint an image of the cost structure of the typical firm that is very different from the one immortalised in textbooks.
Right. So that's very simple, isn't it? So the whole theory falls apart because it ignores fixed costs, and fixed costs is the significant part of the production cost for most things.
That, and also it assumes that firms have diminishing marginal productivity, where in a well-managed factory, well-designed and well-managed factory, you have constant or rising productivity, because nobody... You look at the example of a blast furnace taking 10 workers, and you've got 10 of them, and you've got 10 workers. So in the neoclassical theory, you allocate 1 worker per blast furnace. No, you don't. You could put the 10 of those on one blast furnace and leave the other 10 idle. So you always try to get the best ratio between your variable and fixed costs. This whole idea of using lower levels of input to variable to fixed than is ideal, and then higher, just doesn't happen. And so economists have dreamt a world in which, if their assumptions are correct, then the theory makes you can explain a rising marginal cost curve and therefore a rising supply curve. But their theory is nonsense.
Right.
And in fact, manufacturers felt insulted when they had it explained to them. Some of these manufacturers literally ended up saying they felt insulted by economic theory. And I think they're dead right. They are insulted by economic theory.
So this is right, though, isn't it? Ignoring the direction the curves take. The argument is, when we're looking at those supply and demand curves in our first year of economics, is that you can only sell at a price that the market is going to bear. You can't sell more than that. That's fair enough, isn't it? You can't sell something for more than people are prepared to pay for it. And companies will only produce up to the point where they're maximising their margin. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Unless we include fixed costs within that. But that is probably going to be at the point where they reach 100% capacity and they don't want to make the investment.
Exactly,
Yeah.
And this is the answer that came back from firms when firms were asked what level of capacity, at what level of output capacity do you maximise your profit? The answer of the vast majority of firms was 100%.
Yeah.
So whereas the neoclassical theory and all the drawings they do have got firms maximising their profit at about, say, 50 to 70% of capacity, because they have this assumption of rising marginal cost. Right. And the marginal cost curve the marginal cost lies well above total cost. Now, when firms actually explain what goes on, marginal cost is not only below total cost, it's below variable cost. So anybody who priced at marginal cost would go bankrupt very, very quickly. And this is not your monopolies, not your Googles of the world. It's your ordinary competitive firms. Now, the thing I want to focus on here, which I think is quite hilarious, I've only just realised this in the last couple of weeks, and I've done the research of it in the meantime. Remember I mentioned that Alan Blinder is somebody who found out that firms, literally his empirical research said that only 11% of firms have increasing marginal cost, 89% have either constant or falling. Guess what Alan Blinder's textbook says?
The opposite.
Exactly. he completely ignores his own research. Okay, so he draws the standard economic theory of, first of all, falling marginal cost as you get rising marginal productivity. As you add, you've got a blast furnace with you got 10 workers and 10 blast furnaces.
Short-term memory loss on his part, do you think, or did he not understand the significance of his research?
Preservation of belief system. That's what it comes down to. So it is just hilarious when you look at it that here's a guy who did the research, found out that reality was different to the theory, and stuck with the theory.
Well, it's hard work, isn't it, to rewrite textbooks? So the point at which the two cross. Well, now we've got the supply curve is just a flat line, possibly slanting downwards slightly. The
supply curve, it's not the marginal cost curve. That's the thing. If your supply curve is your marginal cost curve, you've already gone bankrupt because your marginal costs are about 20% of your total cost. And if you price at that level, you're pricing below, not just below you're pricing below your variable costs.
Yeah. So you've got to reach your break-even point. In other words, you've got to get before you do anything. You've got to reach your break-even point where you've covered and each additional output is adding to your EBIT in effect. If, we're talking like businesses talk,
and that's the real world. That's what firms are like. And that's why calculations people do about break-even points make absolute sense, because when you design a factory, you will face diminishing costs. You'll have a markup you put on the price, which the markup it may be constrained to some extent by competition. Okay, so in terms of the scale of markup you can put on, you can't charge $400 for your or let's say $40,000 for your car when comparable cars from comparable firms are being charged $30,000. So you're going to be going roughly around an industry standard markup. But that markup is well above the marginal cost. So neoclassical economists effectively assume that if the going price for a mid-range car is say £20,000, let's use the UK level, then the cost of that last car to produce was £20,000. Now, in fact, the cost of that last car was probably about £4,000.
So I was going to ask, how you can adapt the supply and demand curves in a way that's useful, but it's useless. You just rip those pages out. There's nothing you can learn from it at all.
Exactly. It is setting. What this stuff is doing is conditioning you to believe that a belief system which is irrational is actually a rational description of the real world. And the one reason that you get things like Blinder actually doing this research and then not including it in his own textbook is because that's why when you said the overwhelmingly bad news for economic theory. Because if this is true, and it is true, marginal cost is constant or falling, well below variable cost, let alone below total cost, then you can't have marginal cost pricing. Now, if you can't have marginal cost pricing, neoclassical theory goes out the window. Right. Because the whole idea about efficiency is marginal cost equals marginal revenue, and that's wrong.
We still use that expression, don't we? It's all supply and demand. And it's wrong. I guess it is wrong, but there is something in it as well, isn't there? It's the relationships might be complicated, but there's still a supply and demand relationship, and we can still use that as an overarching expression. If you.
You've got to build a whole new theory. The question is how much the theory actually matters, because to me, macroeconomics is far more. It's
just a piece of the general lexicon, isn't it, that we use? Even non-economists, people go, it's just supply. It's supply and demand, mate. Well, why are you charging so much? Supply and demand. That's why. That's why. That's why I'm trying to rip you off.
Exactly.
Supply and demand. That's want to pay.
Yeah, and that's how it's used in that sense. So it becomes a bit of a cover for the fact that what's actually going on is your markup. And the price itself ends up not being something about allocation of scarce resources. It tends to be part of income distribution between workers and capitalists, because your primary marginal cost is going to be your workers and then your raw material inputs. So it's a price competition between manufacturers, workers, and raw material producers, and that's where your margin gets set. It's got nothing to do with marginal cost. So this whole thing is it's an intellectual virus that I want to get rid of.
Well, hopefully we've done that today. Do you feel better for it? Now we've got that out in the open. I do. Let's spread it as far as we can. All right, let's hope it goes like COVID-19, Steve. We'll only doing good rather than evil. We'll catch you next week. Hey, look, next week I want to talk about central banks. They're clearly on the run from cryptocurrencies, and they want to start spreading their own digital currencies. I want to talk about that, whether that's a good idea and what they hope to achieve from it. We'll do that next week. Good to talk.
Okay.
And if you enjoy listening to a couple of middle-aged blokes prattling on about economics, join us again next week for another edition of the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you then. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.